welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're stepping into territory that is, well, it's incredibly complex.
Yeah, highly debated.
Highly debated, exactly. And it's fundamentally re-examining the very ground we walk on. I really want to specifically welcome those of you tuning in who are, deeply interested in the men's rights movement, red pill philosophy, and just the hidden, often unspoken history of our modern institutions.
Right, the stuff that doesn't really make the nightly news.
Exactly. If you're fascinated by the mechanics of how foundational structures in society shift, evolve, or as the text we're examining today argues, get completely captured by specific ideological frameworks, you are in exactly the right place.
Absolutely. The material we're looking at today leaves absolutely no stone unturned.
Yeah.
When it comes to analyzing the modern cultural landscape, it traces lines from mid-century philosophy all the way to modern corporate marketing and legal redefinitions.
It's massive. And before we really get started, I want to immediately remind you to please like and subscribe to this deep dive channel. It is honestly what allows us to keep doing these massive, incredibly detailed explorations of cutting edge source material for you.
And speaking of cutting edge, we should probably introduce today's mission.
Yeah, let's do it. We are reviewing a highly provocative, brand new 2025 ebook that it's just making massive waves across the internet right now. If you want to follow along with us, or if you just want to read the source material for yourself, I urge you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book right now.
It's a heavy read, but totally worth it.
Oh, for sure. You should also absolutely follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack. That's conradriker.substack.com.
So the book is titled Catabolic Cultural Marxists, Media Megaphone of Satanic Subversion, Female Supremacy, Ideological Indoctrination, and Capture of Institutions by Woke Mind Virus by Conrad Riker.
It's quite the title.
It is. The title alone is a pretty clear indicator that this is a highly aggressive, meticulously detailed polemic. It's not a gentle sociological overview.
Not at all. So our mission today is to basically dissect Riker's exhaustive history of how foundational Western institutions were allegedly captured by a fusion of feminist and Marxist ideologies. This is an ultra-long, incisive, and honestly just fascinating look at modern culture.
He really builds a comprehensive case.
He does. Riker's core premise is that you just cannot understand the daily news cycle or the shifting dynamics in your workplace or even the curriculum in your child's school without thoroughly understanding the history of these institutions before they were captured.
Right. You have to look at the before to understand the after.
Exactly. But before we get into the weeds here, I need to make a very clear, explicit disclaimer for you, the listener. As always, especially with politically charged content, we are here to impartially report and unpack the ideas contained in the source text.
We're just the messengers here.
Right. We are not endorsing or taking sides on the author's viewpoints. We are simply your guides to understanding the exact arguments Riker lays out. Our goal is to give you the pure, unfiltered distillation of this book so you can think critically about it for yourself.
That is the essential framework for our discussion today. Our job is analysis and synthesis. Riker's book is built on a very specific architecture. He's drawing from evolutionary psychology, historical timelines, institutional data.
To make a really sweeping argument.
Exactly, about civilizational trajectory. So whether you find his thesis revelatory or you completely object to its premises, understanding the mechanics of his argument is crucial because it reflects a rapidly growing analytical framework in certain cultural and political spheres right now.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because regardless of where anyone stands, the way Riker meticulously documents these institutional shifts is, well, it's an exercise in pattern recognition that really seeks to change how you view everyday events. He isn't just speaking about wokeness in a vague, abstract sense.
No, he's outlining a very specific mechanical process.
Right. So let's start with the very foundation of his theory, which is embedded right there in the title. The concept of something being catabolic. Riker anchors his entire societal critique in this biological analogy.
Yeah, it's a fascinating way to frame it.
A catabolic process, as he defines it, is like a metabolic parasite. In human biology, metabolism is the building up of tissues, right? Creating muscle, storing energy, generating life.
And catabolism is the exact opposite.
Exactly. It's the breaking down of complex molecules to release energy. It consumes what has already been built. And Riker applies this directly to culture. He argues that the modern ideological movement is entirely catabolic.
Because it consumes a host's resources.
Yes, its cultural capital, its history, its meritocratic standards, without producing any new functional institutions of its own.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker doesn't just present this as a modern phenomenon. He traces its historical roots with intense specificity back to the 1930s and 40s.
Right, the Frankfurt School.
Exactly. He places the genesis of this catabolic process squarely at the feet of the Frankfurt School. The text spends a significant amount of time analyzing Marxist intellectuals like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer.
He focuses a lot on their 1944 work, right?
Yeah, dialectic of enlightenment. According to Riker's analysis, traditional economic Marxism had basically hit a wall in the West. The working class in capital societies just didn't revolt the way Marx predicted.
Because they unionized and bought homes.
Right, they joined the middle class. So, because the economic revolution failed, Riker argues that the Frankfurt School theorists realized they needed to shift the battlefield entirely.
And that shift was from economics to culture. Riker outlines how they created critical theory. In his view, critical theory was literally reverse engineered to dismantle Western institutions by systematically replacing objective truth with subjective identity politics.
It's a total paradigm shift.
It is. He argues that they looked at the foundational pillars of the West, things like the scientific method, the nuclear family, objective logic, and framed them not as tools of human advancement, but as tools of systemic oppression.
The author points to a really profound irony in their philosophy here. Reason and logic, the very tools that cured diseases and built modern infrastructure, were categorized by these theorists as mechanisms of control.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. Riker asserts that by attacking objective truth, they laid the groundwork for a society where merit is replaced by victimhood hierarchies. If there's no objective standard of excellence, then the only metric for power becomes how oppressed a particular group claims to be.
But Riker doesn't stop at mid-century Marxism. He argues that this original ideological engine underwent a massive transformation. And this brings us to what he calls the feminist Marxist fusion.
This is a crucial pivot in his argument.
Yeah. Riker's contention is that this Marxist framework of oppressors versus the oppressed was essentially hijacked by second-wave feminists. Instead of the bourgeoisie exploiting the proletariat, the narrative was recalibrated to frame men as the inherent oppressors and women as the perpetual proletariat.
The text asserts that this fusion specifically targeted the nuclear family and male achievement. And you have to ask, why focus on the family?
Right.
Well, Riker argues that the traditional family unit, which is centered on fatherhood, duty, generational continuity, it naturally resists collectivist, state-dependent models. A strong, independent family unit doesn't need an overarching state bureaucracy to manage it.
So by merging feminist grievances with Marxist power dynamics, Riker claims the ideology began framing all natural hierarchies, standards of excellence, and biological distinctions as artificial constructs. Constructs explicitly designed by men to hold women down.
And this leads right into one of the most complex linguistic arguments in the book, a concept Riker terms satanic narrative inversion.
It's a very provocative term.
It is very provocative, but he uses it to describe a very clinical psychological tactic. He argues that this ideology doesn't merely disagree with traditional values, it systematically flips the moral poles completely upside down through the weaponization of language.
Right, and he details how this semantic inversion operates in practice. Under this framework, behaviors that were traditionally viewed as virtues are completely pathologized.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, so for example, the traditional male drive to protect one's family or community that gets reframed as coercive control or paternalistic oppression. The concept of personal responsibility in Stoicism is suddenly labeled toxic masculinity.
Riker uses the concept of ambition to really highlight this double standard.
Yeah.
He points out that ambition in men is increasingly framed in academic and media circles as colonialism, or a toxic display of patriarchal performance. But then, exactly, the exact same ambitious drive in women is universally celebrated as breaking barriers and shattering glass ceilings.
It's a massive double standard.
He argues this proves the framework isn't actually opposed to power or ambition. It is simply opposed to men possessing it. The action itself is rendered morally neutral. The only thing that matters is the identity of the person taking the action and where they fall on that newly established victimhood hierarchy.
Right. And the author presents this narrative inversion as the primary engine of the catabolic process. By reframing foundational virtues as vices, the ideology actively disarms the very people who would normally defend an institution.
Because if you speak up, you're penalized.
Exactly. If traditional logic is redefined as white patriarchal thinking, which is a phrase Riker documents being used in modern university curricula, then you are blocked from using logic to defend the university standards.
Right. If merit-based hiring is declared inherently inequitable, you literally cannot use performance metrics to defend the institution. The host institution is paralyzed by ideological guilt.
Which allows the catabolic parasite to just consume it from the inside out. Moving from the historical and philosophical underpinnings, Riker then takes a really fascinating turn into evolutionary psychology to explain the why behind this cultural shift.
This is where he introduces the nursery state.
Yes, the nursery state.
Yeah.
He delves deeply into female psychology and poses a pretty fundamental question. How has the maternal instinct itself been weaponized against adult society?
What's fascinating here is how Riker links evolutionary biology directly to modern political behavior. He posits that the maternal instinct is arguably the most powerful biological drive in human females.
That evolutionary imperative to nurture and protect.
Right, to manage and hyper-focus on the safety of children. Riker's central thesis in this section is that when a society actively encourages women to delay, avoid, or entirely reject motherhood, this overwhelming biological drive doesn't just evaporate.
It has to go somewhere.
Exactly. Instead, it is repressed, and subsequently it mutates.
It seeks an alternative outlet. Riker argues that when this maternal energy is untethered from the biological reality of raising a family, it projects outward onto society and the political sphere. It transforms from a localized, nurturing force into a collectivist, totalizing, and ultimately authoritarian drive.
He suggests that women who repress this drive don't raise children, they raise causes.
Yes.
And in doing so, they begin to treat the entire adult public sphere as if it were a giant nursery.
That is the core of what he calls the nursery state. It's maternalism applied to public policy. In this psychological framework, the world is bifurcated into two distinct categories: infants and predators.
Tell me more about the infants.
So infants are the designated victim groups. These are populations that the maternalistic state views as fundamentally vulnerable, lacking agency, and in need of endless protection, equity initiatives, and insulation from the harsh realities of merit or consequence.
And on the other side of that binary, you have the predators, or the monsters. Riker asserts that in the modern ideological landscape, the designated predator class is almost entirely comprised of men. Specifically, traditional, competent, independent men.
Because they don't fit the infantile victim archetype.
Right. Because of that, they are viewed as threats to the safety of the nursery. Therefore, they must be heavily taxed, continuously shamed, closely managed, and regulated by the state to keep the infant safe.
Riker provides concrete examples from modern media and policy to illustrate how this infant versus predator dynamic operates. He extensively analyzes a 2023 BBC documentary titled The Male Problem.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
It really is. According to Riker's breakdown, this documentary was produced by an all-female team with basically no significant male editorial input. He argues that the program framed masculinity entirely as a public health crisis, essentially pathologizing men simply for existing.
Riker points out that the documentary laid the blame for societal issues like violence, suicide, and male loneliness entirely at the feet of men themselves.
Just completely ignoring the broader context.
Exactly. His critique is that it completely ignored the broader societal forces that has systematically dismantled male support structures. Forces like the erosion of the family court system, the mocking of traditional marriage, and the cultural alienation of young boys.
Riker frames this as classic predator archetype projection. The documentary didn't actually investigate why men are struggling. It just assumed that men are inherently defective and require institutional management.
Conversely, Riker looks at how the infant archetype is treated in international policy. He highlights a recent push by UN Women and various corporate HR departments for the implementation of menstrual leave.
This part was wild to read.
Right. Riker analyzes this as a prime example of maternalistic ideology rewarding biology as a disability. The concept posits that women should receive state-mandated or corporate-paid time off simply to manage their natural biological cycles.
Riker points out the profound contradiction here. On one hand, the ideology demands that women be treated as perfectly identical to men in all aspects of workplace capability and leadership.
But then, on the other hand, it pushes policies that treat women as fragile dependents who require institutional protection from their own natural biology. Riker argues this encourages profound dependency and perfectly aligns with the nursery state model, where the institution steps in to swaddle the worker.
The text argues that this mindset even bleeds into early childhood education, completely detaching it from objective reality. Riker cites a children's cartoon aired by the BBC that featured a non-binary chicken that lays eggs.
A non-binary chicken.
Yeah. He uses this seemingly trivial example to illustrate a massive philosophical shift. Given that only biological female chickens can lay eggs, the cartoon presents a biological impossibility.
Right.
Riker argues that the woke mind virus uses this kind of media to teach children that biological reality is entirely optional and subordinate to emotional identity. As a listener, you might want to reflect on how often you see this specific pattern in the media you consume. Do you observe this dynamic where women and minority groups are frequently portrayed as perpetually innocent victims requiring systemic protection, while men are overwhelmingly portrayed as perpetually guilty problems requiring systemic management?
It's a lens that really changes how you see things once you notice it.
Absolutely. Riker's ultimate warning in this section is that this infantile logic destroys the concept of adult sovereignty. It replaces a robust society of competent, independent adults who can navigate conflict and difference with a society of fragile dependents who constantly demand that an authoritarian state referee their emotional discomfort.
That demand for an authoritarian referee is exactly what provides the mechanism for the ideology to capture legacy institutions. Riker argues that institutions don't fall because they are overpowered from the outside. They fall because their internal mechanisms are rewired to prioritize emotional safety over objective excellence.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This brings us to a highly detailed portion of Riker's analysis, the mechanics of institutional capture. The author claims that foundational structures, specifically education, media, and the legal system, are currently locked in what he describes as a diversity death spiral.
Let's break down his specific analysis of the education system first, which he views as the epicenter of the death of meritocracy.
Good idea. Riker posits that elite educational institutions have largely abandoned their historical mandate to be temples of rigorous logic and objective literacy, functioning instead as ideological daycares.
He uses Yale Law School as a primary case study. In 2020, Yale Law School made the decision to transition to a pass-fail grading system, effectively eliminating traditional class rankings.
And to understand Riker's critique, you have to understand the traditional pipeline. Class rank at a place like Yale Law is the primary meritocratic metric used by federal judges to select candidates for highly prestigious Supreme Court clerkships.
So Riker asks, what was the tangible result of intentionally removing that meritocratic hierarchy? He points to the data. By 2023, applications to Yale Law School from top-tier, high-performing undergraduate students plummeted by 41%.
41% is a huge drop.
It's massive. Riker interprets this data to mean that elite students who have spent their lives striving for excellence do not want to invest in a degree that intentionally makes them indistinguishable from their mediocre peers. They seek environments that reward distinction.
The author argues that when an institution erases performance-based hierarchy in the name of equity, it does not achieve fairness. It simply guarantees its own slide into irrelevance.
This is the exact mechanism of Riker's diversity death spiral. An institution lowers its objective standards to achieve ideological diversity. Inevitably, the institution begins to fail at its primary function, which is producing excellence.
But they don't blame the lowered standards.
Exactly. Instead of recognizing that lowering standards caused the failure, the ideological bureaucracy blames the failure on a lingering lack of inclusivity. This justifies doubling down on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which lower standards even further, creating a feedback loop until the institution collapses under the weight of its own incompetence.
And Riker documents this happening at the curriculum level as well. He specifically analyzes changes at Stanford University. He notes that Stanford eliminated its long-standing Western civilization requirement in 2022, replacing it with a course framework focused on intersectional narratives of marginalized ontologies.
It's quite a mouthful.
It is. Riker highlights the profound civilizational irony here. He argues that the university is intentionally erasing the specific Western philosophical tradition that birthed the scientific method, the concept of human rights, and the principle of free speech,
and replacing it with ideological courses that actively train students to deconstruct objective reality.
Exactly. He even cites extreme examples within academia where standard English grammar, specifically subject-verb-object structure, is critiqued as a form of settler violence or linguistic colonization.
The author emphasizes that this ideology is not merely a dry academic exercise. It possesses a deeply punitive emotional component, particularly when applied to young boys in the primary education system.
Right.
Riker recounts a highly illustrative incident involving a Canadian middle school that conducted a privilege walk.
For context for you listening, Riker explains that a privilege walk is a common DEI exercise where students start on a line and are told to step forward or backward based on a series of statements about their intersecting demographic identities.
And Riker describes a specific scenario where a young boy from a highly disadvantaged background, his parents were divorced, he had no financial safety net, and he was raised by a struggling working mother, ended up standing in the very back row of the exercise.
And according to the account, the boy began to cry from the public humiliation.
Riker uses this to dissect the rigid, unyielding nature of the ideological framework. The boy was not wealthy, he held no institutional power. But because he possessed the biological traits of being male and cisgender, the moral framework of the exercise automatically categorized him as an oppressor who held systemic privilege over his female and minority classmates.
Riker characterizes this pedagogical practice as a form of emotional sadism wrapped in the language of social justice. He argues it is meticulously designed to humiliate young boys, instilling a sense of inherent guilt simply for existing.
While simultaneously elevating victimhood as the highest possible social currency for girls and minority groups.
It reinforces his thesis that the system is not designed to uplift the disadvantaged. It is designed to psychologically punish the designated predator class.
The book then transitions from how this ideology is taught to how it is enforced among adults, specifically within the media landscape. Riker introduces a behavioral concept he calls covert GSR.
Right. Gossip, shaming, and rallying.
Exactly. He uses this to explain how ideological conformity is maintained without explicit written rules. Drawing on anthropological studies of social aggression, Riker posits that while male social enforcement often relies on overt, physical, or direct hierarchical confrontation, female social enforcement relies on conditional, reputational destruction.
Which he argues now dominates ideological institutions.
Right. Covert GSR is the mechanism of the hive mind. If an individual within an institution questions the prevailing narrative, they are not debated on the merits of their argument.
No, instead they are gossiped about through back channels, publicly shamed on internal communication platforms like Slack or Twitter, and then the group rallies collectively to HR or management to demand their expulsion to restore emotional safety.
Riker uses the New York Times' highly controversial 1619 Project as his primary case study for covert GSR in action.
The 1619 Project was a massive editorial initiative that sought to fundamentally reframe the founding of the United States. It argued that the nation's true founding was not 1776, but 1619, with the arrival of the first enslaved Africans, and that the Revolutionary War was fought primarily to preserve slavery.
Riker points out that this narrative was championed heavily by female editors and writers within the Times. The crucial element of Riker's analysis is not just the project itself, but the institutional response to the massive pushback it received.
Because professional, highly respected historians from across the political spectrum, including Pulitzer Prize winners like James McPherson and Gordon Wood, publicly tore the project's core historical claims apart. They demonstrated that they were factually inaccurate.
But Riker notes that the New York Times essentially ignored the historians. The author argues that within the framework of the captured institution, it simply did not matter that the core premise was historically flawed.
The narrative was too emotionally satisfying and too politically useful for the ideological hive mind to abandon. Objective historical fact was subordinated to narrative utility.
Riker asserts that the covert GSR mechanism ensured that anyone inside the New York Times newsroom who might have agreed with the historians and questioned the project's accuracy was intimidated into silence. They were terrified of being shamed and fired for being complicit in white supremacy.
Riker argues that while this is damaging in education and media, it becomes genuinely dystopian when this framework captures the legal system. He dedicates a significant portion of the book to analyzing the legal implications of the feminist Marxist fusion, using Sweden as his primary cautionary tale.
Sweden is presented in the text as the canary in the coal mine for Western jurisprudence. Riker details how feminist legal theory successfully lobbied for a radical redefinition of rape and sexual assault laws in Sweden.
The legal standard was expanded far beyond traditional definitions of force or lack of explicit consent, right?
Exactly. It expanded to include incredibly subjective criteria, which Riker translates as non-consensual emotional discomfort.
Which is terrifying from a legal standpoint.
It is. Riker scrutinizes the evidentiary standards, or lack thereof, inherent in legislating emotional states. He argues that legal phrases centering on discomfort are intentionally designed to be overwhelmingly vague.
And this vagueness allows the state to effectively criminalize normal, clumsy male courtship behavior, or even retroactively criminalize a consensual encounter if one party later decides they feel emotionally uncomfortable about it.
The text points to immediate and severe consequences following the adoption of these legal standards. Riker cites data claiming a 400% surge in false or highly questionable allegations entering the Swedish legal system.
400%. That is staggering. The author then traces the profound societal ripple effects of this legal capture. How did Swedish men respond to a legal environment where subjective feelings carry the weight of empirical evidence?
According to Riker's research, they simply began to opt out.
Riker cites sociological surveys indicating that a staggering percentage of men under 30 in Sweden, upwards of 60% in some polls, reported a strong preference for remaining single and avoiding the dating market entirely.
Riker's analysis is that these men made a rational calculation. The legal risk of a ruined life, based on nothing more than an accusation of discomfort, vastly outweighed the biological and social rewards of dating.
The author draws a direct causal line between this legally enforced atmosphere of suspicion and Sweden's plummeting marriage and birth rates.
He argues this proves that when a legal system is captured by female supremacist ideology, it abandons the principles of blind justice and evidentiary rigor. It prioritizes the emotional validation of the infant class while leaving the male predator class legally defenseless against the power of the state.
This analysis of the legal and institutional landscape leads directly into one of the most resonant arguments in the book, focusing on the systemic pathologizing of men navigating the modern world. Riker defines this as a top-down war on masculinity, institutionalized through what he calls the boy tax.
And he points out that this isn't just happening in fringe academic circles. It is being codified by the most authoritative bodies in the country, such as the American Psychological Association.
The text places heavy emphasis on the American Psychological Association's recent publication of formal guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men. Riker analyzes these guidelines and highlights a startling paradigm shift.
The APA formally classified traditional masculinity as an ideology that is, on the whole, psychologically harmful.
The guidelines specifically listed traits historically associated with masculinity traits, such as dominance, emotional control, self-reliance, stoicism, and a strong orientation toward achievement, and explicitly linked them to negative outcomes like violence, homophobia, and depression.
Riker heavily critiques the profound historical amnesia required to pathologize these specific traits.
The author argues that self-reliance, stoicism in the face of hardship, and an aggressive drive toward achievement are the exact evolutionary traits that allowed men to build modern infrastructure, to win global conflicts against tyranny, and drive the technological innovations that define the modern era.
Riker's contention is that under the new feminist Marxist framework, masculinity is no longer viewed as a vital societal resource to be cultivated and directed toward productive ends. Rather, it is viewed as a systemic mental health disorder that must be medicated, managed, or entirely eradicated from the population.
This top-down pathologizing translates into everyday life through the concept Riker introduces as the boy tax. He uses this term to describe the pervasive institutional penalty that is applied to boys simply for exhibiting standard biologically driven male behavior.
Riker paints a picture of the modern classroom environment, which he argues has been entirely feminized. It is an environment that demands students sit perfectly still, remain quiet, and avoid all physical confrontation or roughhousing for hours on end.
Which is pretty much the opposite of how boys operate.
Exactly. Riker argues this environment is diametrically opposed to boy biology. When a boy inevitably acts like a boy, if he takes physical risks, if he expresses a desire to compete rather than cooperate, if he asserts dominant leadership, or if he uses physical aggression to protect a boundary, he is hit with the boy tax.
He is shamed by the teacher, sent to the principal's office, given detention, or told by authority figures that he is exhibiting toxic masculinity.
Conversely, Riker notes that the system heavily rewards and incentivizes behaviors that align with the nursery state model: passivity, high emotional verbalization, compliance, and conflict avoidance.
The author's central argument here is that the modern educational and social system is not a neutral playing field. It is explicitly rigged to penalize male nature while rewarding female nature.
And Riker backs up this assertion with significant sociological data. He dedicates a section to analyzing research out of Stanford regarding the psychological well-being of boys in highly progressive educational environments.
Riker breaks down the data, which indicates that male self-esteem scores in the most progressive, ideologically captured school districts plummeted by 27% in the decade following 2010.
The author points out that this decline correlates perfectly with the period when intersectional gender ideology and DEI frameworks were heavily integrated into primary education curricula.
He argues that you cannot systematically teach a demographic that their inherent nature is toxic and oppressive without causing a catastrophic collapse in their psychological well-being.
Riker also examines how the medical establishment operates within this matrix. He returns to data from the APA, noting that boys who strongly identify with traditional masculine norms are significantly more likely, up to 3.2 times more likely, to be referred by schools for mental health screenings and ADHD evaluations.
3.2 times more likely. That's a massive discrepancy.
It is. Riker's interpretation of this statistic is deeply cynical. He argues that these boys are not being referred because they are genuinely mentally ill. Rather, they are being referred because they are normal, high-energy boys trapped in a bureaucratic system that demands docile, compliant subjects.
Riker posits that if a young man is naturally stoic, silent, and goal-oriented, he represents a behavioral threat to the ideological order of the classroom. Therefore, the system labels him as at risk and pushes him into the pharmaceutical and therapeutic pipeline to chemically or psychologically unlearn his own nature.
The author frames this as a form of societal psychological castration, disguised as compassionate healthcare. But Riker argues this war on masculinity goes far beyond the treatment of individual boys. It extends to a systemic cultural erasure of male archetypes and heroes.
He uses a really striking example regarding the curation of historical monuments to make this point.
Riker details an incident at a university in New Mexico involving a long-standing plaque dedicated to the Navajo Code Talkers.
The Code Talkers, for historical context, were a specialized group of real biological men who leveraged their complex native language to create an unbreakable cryptographic code for the U.S. Marine Corps. A contribution that demonstrably saved thousands of American lives during the Pacific theater of World War II.
Riker documents that the university administration decided to remove this plaque, citing concerns that it promoted militaristic glorification and did not align with their inclusive values.
Riker points out that the true nature of the catabolic process is revealed not just by what is destroyed, but by what replaces it. The university did not simply leave an empty wall. Instead, they erected a new monument dedicated to the concept of non-binary resistance in pre-Columbian societies.
Riker uses this specific exchange as the perfect distillation of his entire thesis. The Navajo Code Talkers represent objective reality, actual men who demonstrated immense bravery, facing physical danger to defeat actual fascists.
The replacement monument, Riker argues, represents pure ideological fiction. He asserts that there is zero robust historical or anthropological evidence to support the modern academic concept of non-binary gender identity existing as a formalized resistance movement in pre-Columbian tribal societies.
It is, according to the author, a clear case of projecting 21st century gender theory backward onto ancient cultures to manufacture a historical lineage.
Riker argues the underlying goal of this cultural erasure is demoralization. By removing monuments to real male sacrifice and heroism and replacing them with monuments to imagine ideologically compliant identities, the institution ensures that young boys walking through that campus have no tangible historical male role models to aspire to.
They are only presented with evidence of their demographic's supposed historical guilt, while abstract state-sanctioned identities are elevated in marble.
Having established this landscape of institutional hostility toward men, Riker then pivots in the next section of the book to turn his analytical lens onto the demographic driving this process. He dives deeply into the data surrounding what he controversially terms the childless coven.
Exploring the intersection of female psychology, modern consumerism, and what he calls the myth of the happy single woman.
Riker relies heavily on established demographic research here, citing longitudinal studies from Harvard University and drawing heavily on the sociological frameworks established by Robert Putnam in his seminal book, Bowling Alone.
Riker's overarching argument in this section is that the grand feminist project of the last half-century, the narrative that women do not need men, that the nuclear family is oppressive, and that true ultimate fulfillment is found through corporate careerism and sexual independence, has been a catastrophic, empirically measurable failure in terms of human happiness.
Riker breaks down the Harvard data to support this claim. He points out that across multiple measures of life satisfaction, single women under the age of 40 consistently self-report significantly lower levels of happiness, higher levels of anxiety, and greater use of antidepressants than married men with children.
Riker notes that this remains true even in cohorts where the single women out-earn the married men. He pairs this with Putnam's theories on social capital, arguing that the intricate web of community connections women traditionally fostered has collapsed since the 1970s.
Correlating perfectly with their mass entry into the corporate workforce and the resulting decline in marriage rates. Riker poses a crucial question based on this data. If millions of women are not finding the promised fulfillment in corporate careers, and they have actively rejected the biological and social grounding of building a family, where does all that displaced energy go?
According to Riker's hypothesis, this massive reservoir of unfulfilled energy is channeled directly into ideological zealotry and rampant, identity-driven consumerism.
He suggests that women who lack the profound sense of purpose and future orientation that motherhood naturally provides often become the most aggressive enforcers of the woke mind virus.
Because they have rejected the concept of building a future through children, Riker argues they become obsessively fixated on the present, hyper-focusing on social status, luxury consumption, and the pursuit of fleeting emotional intensity.
And Riker asserts that corporate America, rather than pushing back, has completely bent the knee to this specific demographic, creating what he calls the woke retail matrix.
He explains that this is a self-reinforcing economic loop. You have a massive demographic of affluent, fundamentally unhappy, highly ideological female consumers who demand constant moral validation from the brands they purchase.
Corporations, terrified of PR backlashes, coordinated boycotts, and internal revolts from their own captured HR departments, eagerly comply.
Riker details how this compliance manifests in marketing strategies. The woke retail matrix doesn't just sell products, it sells ideological affirmation, often by explicitly demonizing men or intentionally subverting traditional standards of beauty.
Riker provides several high-profile corporate case studies to illustrate this dynamic, starting with the cosmetics giant Sephora.
Right. Riker analyzes Sephora's highly publicized launch of a gender-free beauty campaign. The company heavily promoted products like unisex foundation and featured male-presenting models in their storefronts, signaling their deep commitment to inclusivity and the deconstruction of gender norms.
However, Riker points to leaked internal sales data that revealed the reality behind the marketing. 93% of the consumers purchasing these supposedly gender-free products were still women.
Riker uses this data to argue that the campaign was never actually about capturing a new market of male makeup consumers. Instead, he posits, it was purely about ideological conquest.
By utilizing the language of inclusivity, the brand was advancing a female-centric worldview that actively forces men to navigate and accept a highly feminized cultural space, while simultaneously branding any male discomfort with the shift as evidence of bigotry.
It is, in Riker's view, a dominance play disguised as retail marketing.
Riker then examines how this retail matrix attacks the traditional female form itself, using the clothing retailer Zara as his next example. He documents that in 2022, Zara began removing classic mannequins, the ones designed with a traditional hourglass, narrow-waisted female shape, from many of their flagship stores.
They replace them with shapeless, cylindrical, gender-neutral blocks.
The crucial detail Riker highlights is the internal corporate justification for this change. The company's messaging explicitly labeled the classic female shape as problematic and exclusionary.
Riker finds this utterly astonishing from an evolutionary perspective. The natural biological female waist-to-hip ratio, a trait tied directly to fertility and admired across almost all of human history art, is suddenly pathologized as a social disease by the very corporate entities that claim to champion female empowerment.
Riker argues this perfectly demonstrates that the catabolic ideology is fundamentally at war with biological nature itself. But the most aggressive and controversial corporate example Riker analyzes is a campaign by the athletic brand Nike. He dissects their "you can't stop us" marketing campaign.
Riker meticulously breaks down the visual language of a specific commercial within that campaign. He notes that the advertisement featured a rapid montage of athletic empowerment, which included a highly jarring scene where a woman literally punches a man directly in the face. Riker emphasizes that this was not portrayed as self-defense, nor was it a symbolic gesture. It was a depiction of unprovoked, literal physical violence against a defenseless male figure.
Yet, the corporate fitting of the commercial presented this act purely as an expression of female empowerment and strength.
Riker asks the obvious toughest question. Did alienating half the population actually work for Nike financially?
The author presents a nuanced look at the data. In the short term, yes. Riker cites a University of Chicago economic study showing that the brand experienced a 15% jump in short-term sales, driven largely by the massive media attention and the rallying of the ideological demographic we discussed earlier. However, Riker points to the long-term metrics as the true indicator of the catabolic effect. Subsequent surveys showed that long-term brand trust and loyalty among the broader general public dropped by a staggering 22%.
Riker argues that the general populace eventually sees through the hostile propaganda. He concludes that the woke retail matrix is not actually about moving products or building enduring brands. It is about utilizing corporate megaphones to sell an ideology.
In doing so, it consumes and destroys the brand's accumulated cultural capital, which is the exact definition of catabolic behavior. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We have traversed the historical origins, the evolutionary psychology, the mechanics of institutional capture, the systemic war on boys, and the corporate pandering matrix.
Riker presents a remarkably bleak picture of the legacy institutions. But is it simply game over?
This brings us to the final major section of Riker's book, the male resistance movement. How are men actually responding to this catabolic spiral in the real world?
This raises an incredibly important question about the trajectory of the culture, because Riker forcefully insists that men are not simply taking this lying down. He argues that the captured institutions operate under the arrogant assumption that men will quietly accept their marginalization and fade into irrelevance.
However, Riker presents data suggesting that a massive systemic backlash is currently brewing under the surface of mainstream culture. He highlights a truly staggering statistic from a recent Pew Research poll. 42% of men under the age of 30 now self-identify with the term red-pilled.
The author emphasizes the sheer scale of that number. 42% is not a fringe, dark web internet subculture. That represents nearly half of an entire generational cohort.
Riker points out that just a few years prior, in 2018, that number was hovering around 12%.
Riker interprets this as evidence of a seismic, unstoppable cultural shift. He argues that millions of young men are actively rejecting the narrative handed down by the media and academia.
They are independently reading evolutionary psychology, they are studying the unvarnished history of these institutions, and they are recognizing that the societal game is explicitly rigged against their nature and their success. Riker maps out a very specific, repeatable pipeline for how men are arriving at this realization.
He argues it rarely happens through academic debate. It usually begins with a severe personal shock to the system.
The pipeline Riker identifies follows a distinct pattern. It often begins with a traumatic interaction with the captured institutions, perhaps a brutal, highly biased divorce proceeding in family court, or facing a baseless Title IX accusation on a college campus.
This event violently shatters the man's inherent belief in the fairness of the system. Finding no sympathy in mainstream culture, this leads him to seek out alternative online forums, looking for answers and shared experiences.
That online exposure leads to rigorous self-education, men reading the specific authors and philosophers that legacy media explicitly tells them are dangerous or forbidden.
This shared knowledge base builds deep community bonds with other men who have had the veil lifted. And finally, Riker observes, this localized community building is now translating into real-world activism and the construction of parallel institutions.
Riker provides a brilliant, almost darkly humorous example of this fundamental mindset shift by analyzing a viral story from the social media platform Reddit.
The author uses this story because it perfectly encapsulates the modern men going their own way ethos. Riker details a post where a man wrote, "My wife left me for a yoga instructor to find herself. I responded by clearing out the garage and building a powerlifting gym. 2 years later, I benched 315 pounds, my business is thriving, and she texted saying she made a mistake and wants me back. I left her on read."
Riker points out that this seemingly simple post was upvoted over 87,000 times by other men. Why? Because, according to Riker, it serves as a modern manifesto of masculine self-mastery.
Riker analyzes the opposing paths taken by the two individuals in the story. It is the ultimate rejection of the catabolic game.
Exactly as Riker frames it. The wife followed the script provided by the feminist Marxist culture-chasing, fleeting emotional intensity, breaking a commitment for self-actualization, and relying on the divorce apparatus.
The man, conversely, reverted to the most ancient, traditional masculine path. Extreme physical discipline, emotional resilience, stoicism, and building his own intrinsic value, entirely independent of female validation.
And in the end, his methodology won. He refused to allow the chaos of her emotionally driven decisions to destroy his sovereignty, Riker argues this viral resonance proves that when men simply stop playing by the rigged rules and focus on their own excellence, the entire charade of female supremacy loses its power over them.
And Riker emphasizes that this movement is rapidly moving far beyond individual guys building garage gyms. Men are organizing and building physical, real-world parallel structures to replace the institutions they have abandoned. He dedicates a chapter to examining communities like the Manor House in Austin, Texas.
Riker describes the Manor House as a localized, intentional commune formed entirely by men who made the conscious decision to completely opt out of the mainstream, feminized societal structure.
Within this community, men pool their resources, share high-end tools, maintain each other's vehicles, and even coordinate educational and childcare duties for single fathers, entirely without female involvement or state oversight.
Riker describes the culture of this environment as being completely devoid of covert GSR. There is no manufactured drama, no emotional manipulation, and no HR bureaucracy. It is based entirely on brotherhood, utility, and mutual trust.
Riker argues these men are quietly, methodically rebuilding the foundational blocks of civilization from the ground up, based on competence rather than ideological compliance.
Furthermore, Riker documents that this resistance is organizing politically and deploying serious financial capital. He covers the rise of initiatives like the Iron Summit retreats.
Riker explains that these are highly disciplined, men-only physical and intellectual retreats. They are designed to completely disconnect men from the digital world and the omnipresent woke matrix.
The focus is on intense physical training paired with rigorous intellectual debate, serving as a detoxification process from the constant societal shaming men endure. But beyond retreats, Riker points to hard legal action. He highlights the formation of the Men's Rights Legal Defense Fund, noting that they recently raised over $12 million strictly through grassroots crowdfunding.
The author stresses the significance of that number. $12 million is serious, weaponized capital.
And Riker details exactly how they are deploying it. They are using this war chest specifically to go on the offensive, launching massive defamation and tort interference lawsuits against feminist NGOs, university Title IX Acts offices, and legacy media outlets that publish false accusations.
Riker argues that the existence of these robust alternative economies and well-funded legal strike teams proves that the male resistance is not just a group of defeated men dropping out of society to play video games. Rather, they are actively working to rescue the concept of civilization from feminist capture by aggressively building impenetrable structures that the catabolic virus simply cannot touch.
We have covered an immense, challenging amount of ground today, tracing Riker's arguments from the Frankfurt School to modern legal defense funds. Let's move to synthesize all of this. Based on this exhaustive analysis, what is Riker's ultimate call to action for you, the listener, who has absorbed this framework?
Riker's concluding message is fundamentally aimed at empowering his specific target audience. His ultimate call to action is a demand for men to stop apologizing. The text urges men to refuse to apologize for being biological males. It tells them to stop apologizing for possessing naturally aggressive, logical, ambitious, or highly competitive traits.
Riker implores his readers to master their physical bodies through discipline, to aggressively defend their minds by turning off legacy media indoctrination, and to actively participate in the funding and building of parallel structures.
He wants men to consciously create and defend spaces that strictly honor merit, revere objective truth, and demand personal responsibility, the exact foundational pillars that he argues the catabolic institutions are currently consuming and destroying.
It's a call for men to become functionally uncancelable by virtue of simply achieving total independence from the institutions that despise them. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. It is something that naturally builds on Riker's catabolic theory, but is left largely unresolved in the text as an open question for the future.
The thought experiment is this. If these massive legacy institutions, the Ivy League universities, with their billion-dollar endowments, the mainstream media conglomerates, the massive corporate HR bureaucracies, are truly acting as catabolic parasites, as Riker exhaustively argues. If they only survive by consuming their own historical foundations and burning through the cultural capital built by the competent men of previous generations, what exactly happens the day they finally run out of fuel?
When the endowment money inevitably dries up because alumni stop donating and their cultural credibility hits absolute zero, will the parallel, highly disciplined, merit-based structures currently being quietly built by the men's resistance movement simply inherit the earth by default as the old system collapses under its own weight?
Or is a massive, unavoidable, and perhaps highly volatile collision between these two entirely incompatible realities looming on the horizon.
That is a fascinating and deeply sobering question to ponder as you watch the trajectory of our culture unfold. What is the end game when the parasite finally kills the host? It's a lens that will certainly change how you view the daily news cycle. Listeners, if you want to dive into the deep end of this argument yourself and explore the vast amount of data we didn't even have time to cover, I strongly urge you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook Catabolic Cultural Marxists.
Whether you find Riker's framework to be a revelation or a provocation, the sheer depth of his research makes it an absolute must-read for anyone wanting to fully grasp the mechanics of these ongoing societal shifts.
It is an undeniably dense, challenging, and highly detailed architectural map of the modern culture war.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And be sure to follow the author directly to see how his theories are evolving in real time.
You can find him at Conrad Riker on Substack. Again, that's conradriker.substack.com. You can also track his ongoing commentary on Twitter at Conrad Riker and watch his video essays on YouTube at Conrad Riker. And finally, one last reminder from us. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to this deep dive channel. We rely entirely on your support to keep bringing you these intense, unfiltered, and exhaustive explorations of the most impactful ideas shaping our world today. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the hidden history of modern institutions, and we will see you on the next deep dive.